Welcome to the World Wild Podcast. I'm your host, Miles Irving, and I'll shortly be welcoming John Kallas to the World Wild Podcast. But just a few things to say as a kind of preamble to that. So something that comes out of conversations, or hopefully comes out of conversations, is to kind of change your perspective. So I think there's a commitment that I've kind of made and am doing my best to stick to, which is never to be certain about anything in a sense. I'll explain what I mean. So obviously we are certain about what we think provisionally, like people were certain that the earth was flat, for example, but then came evidence to the contrary, and people had to accept that their certainties were being challenged, and eventually now there's a consensus that the earth is round. That's without getting into this insane flat earth thing that's emerged in the last few years. But that aside, most of us just accept that there's a new certainty, provisional certainty, which is that the earth is round or spherical. So one of the commitments that kind of come off the back of that commitment is that conversations are not spaces in which to just have your own certainties shored up and reinforced. Whilst birds of a feather no doubt do flock together, and most people who come on this podcast do share a certain amount of common ground. But I think it's almost more interesting to sort of look back through these conversations and see where there's a slight disagreement, especially when I kind of assume that we see things the same. So yeah, I just think it's worth flagging that up and encouraging you as you listen to sort of look out for that, and that this is not intended to be the presentation of absolutely fixed perspectives that are 100% right and therefore need to be wholly taken on board by other people. So whilst I hope that there's a certain amount of clarity coming through with what's said week after week, just to be clear, it's not my intention to in any way suggest that we've got it all figured out. So the almost the more interesting thing is to see the progression and the journey unfolding, as it were. So I said all that because I wanted to just point to something in this episode, the conversation with John, because I came to the conversation with a fairly fixed view, which is slightly critical of the whole genre of teaching as an end in itself. And that view was basically that people need to teach what they deeply know themselves. Now, that in itself hasn't changed. But I came with an assumption that when John Kallas embarked on the journey of teaching wild food, it was because he was already deeply embedded in that with a personal practical knowledge. And it turns out that I was completely wrong about that. So you'll see me having that view corrected in the course of the conversation. So I now find myself with a sort of reworked, kind of deep respect for the idea of teaching as an end in itself, but with the qualification that John has in fact fulfilled the criteria that I've been wishing to emphasize there. In the course of learning to become an excellent educator, which he clearly is, he has gone to great lengths to become practically embedded in the thing that he's teaching in order to be able to teach it. And I think that's fantastic, because one of my concerns is that the field of outdoor education is potentially giving rise to people teaching foraging where they've just done a short course in it or something. And I actually do feel that it needs to be something where people are practitioners, and they may just do what John has done and learn to be practitioners in preparation for the teaching work. But I think we do need to have people behaving like the village elders that we keep talking so much about. And especially if they're teaching things like forest school, that the teachers need to be giving out of what they're living rather than something that they've just learned on a short course. So that brings me to introduce this week's guest, John Kallas, who runs a thing called Wild Food Adventures in Portland, Oregon. And John is, as already alluded to, primarily a wild food educator, and he does a really good job of that, which as you'll hear in more detail, has been very influential on me in the early days when I was really getting down to learning plants. John's material was absolutely key on that journey for me. And John runs a lot of courses out there, and he does some really interesting ones, but that are perhaps a bit more focused. than some courses. They'll take you to a specific place to learn a specific kind of thing. For example, he does one on the beach that's learning seaweeds and shellfish, and he also does a focused one on salads, another one on weeds. So yeah, to anyone living in that region that doesn't already know John, it'd be great for you to check it out. But for anyone else, it's probably quite instructive to go to his website and check out some of the resources there. So yeah, we'll get right on now to that conversation with John. It's a real pleasure to welcome John Kallas to the World Wild Podcast. Hi, John.
Hi, good to see you.
Good to see you. So I just wanted to say that I was describing to a friend who it was I was going to be talking to today. And the thing is, you were really influential in the formative stages of our whole setup over here with Forager and the book that I wrote. Because back then in England, we had a couple of foraging books floating around, but without meaning any disrespect to people that wrote them, they were not written by people who were engaged in wild food education.
Oh, right.
So wrote books and had a good research team and were great at conveying the whole inspiration of you can eat wild food and some of the history of it. But there was nobody writing about wild food in the UK. There was actually really a practitioner. Mm. So I had to search the internet to because my background was basically mushrooms and berries, and I was just beginning to start engaging with plants. So my very first route in was a guy called Carluccio, who's an Italian chef. So he got me working with a few plants. I was moving out from just being a mushroom and berry guy to being a leaf and herbs and all of this sort of thing. But after those basics that I learned from that book, I didn't really have anywhere else to go to have some real proper information about how to work with plants. So it was your Wild Food Adventures that basically opened the subject up. And I don't know if you remember, but I had to phone you and ask how do I buy your Wild Food Adventures? So John, I think it's out of print now, isn't it?
No. It's we're up to about 70,000 copies at this point.
Amazing. So John used to put this bulletin out called Wild Food Adventures. It was really nicely done. Little sort of.
You're talking about the newsletter. I used to do a newsletter.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
They were in little. It was like a little magazine.
Yeah.
About the same size as our local parish church monthly newsletter in this country. They kind of look like that. But I had to phone John up and say, how can I subscribe to this? I'm in England. And John gave me his bank details. I had to go into my local branch and do this bank transfer. It was all kind of, I guess we weren't having this traffic of information internationally that we have now, where we can just email each other and everything like that. Yeah. But anyway, so John started sending me this. He sent me all the back copies, and then I got it coming through every whenever you put it out until I think it was 2000
times a year.
Yeah. But that was so formative for me because your approach to things of wanting to, so many people writing about wild food, they just, as long as they got something to say, they'll say, "Oh, I managed to say something. I've now covered." Where it's almost like you just got to fill a blank page under the heading of nettles, and now you've ticked the box. Whereas your approach was, I'm actually trying to give what I felt, and I know you've written extensively about this, that you want to give people the tools to actually engage with these plants safely and effectively and in a way that gives satisfaction. So, John, I've done a lot of talking. You're supposed to be here to talk, and I'm talking.
Well, yeah. So, I think the idea is that we're no longer in a society that knows plants. We are now in modern society. When you grow up, if you're a kid and you're taking classes, you don't even take botany classes anymore. No. It just doesn't exist. When you get into college, you're talking about genetic engineering and all that kind of stuff, but not really botany anymore, or cultural anthropology, basically, which is what, where you learn about plants. And so what I view my role is as sort of like an elder who is taking you out, only, it's with a book. I'm taking you out into the field and I'm teaching you everything you need to know in order to use that plant. I mean, I'm talking about what the plant looks like from a seedling, and as it's growing, I give photographs in my book of all the stages of growth, close-ups of edible parts at their prime, and then simple basic recipes just so you can get started and not feel intimidated. The whole meaning of that was to be the elder. That, if I couldn't be there in person, how could I teach you all that you need to know? Which took us out of the what I call, and probably what you experience too, is the idea of a plant catalog. Most wild food books when I was growing up were like clothing catalogs, where you had a picture and then you had a description. Usually it was one page. That's all they did. One picture, usually at the plant when it was not even at its prime. It was probably too old. It was in flower because of wildflower books. And so, so the wild food books were just repeating what wildflower books were doing rather than actually showing you the plant. And so as an educator, because I'm an educator before I'm anything else.
Can we go one step back?
Yeah.
To what you actually do in your personal life? Because you are a practitioner first, surely. Do you see what I mean? Before you even want to educate someone, you do actually eat wild food, is the point I'm making.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I'm primarily a researcher and an educator.
Yeah.
I don't live off of wild foods.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that to me, that kind of life, I would not get anything else done. So one of the things that, one of the ways to look at this is back when everybody was a forager.
Yeah.
Back way back before industrialization, all that kind of stuff. Even when there was some farming, people foraged in communities. So you had whole tribes that would, so let's say you had 100 people in a tribe, just theoretically, 10 would be off to one location where they knew a plant was in season, and they would set up a little mini factory and they would collect it and process it and then bring it back for storage, mostly storage. They're not just eating as they're going along. Another 10 people in the tribe would be somewhere else doing the same thing with a different plant. So the goal was to find plants in great quantity, to gather in great quantity, to then store that food, and so that those people then could live all year long by foraging whatever was available at that moment in time, but also the other 12 months of the year pulling stuff out of storage that they were, that they had gathered before, and that gave them a complete diet. Now, so if you imagine one person trying to do all of that, it's nuts. That's all you would be doing, and your diet would be fairly simplistic because, one person can only gather so many plants.
Well, I'm not sure if you're aware, but a friend of mine, a former colleague, Fergus Drennan, did this incredible thing that he actually did live entirely off wild food for 3 months.
Sure.
But it's always the thought that I had about that what he was trying to do and very heroically did achieve for 3 months was something that no one in the history of the universe has ever attempted to do, because he was doing it on his own.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Sam Thayer tried the same thing. He only did it for a month.
But that was he and his wife. At least there was two of them.
Yeah. Well, but the other thing is we have all the modern conveniences today. We've got a place where we can wash and clean things, and we've got food processors, and I don't know, what facilities he had available to himself. So that accelerates things a little bit, but that's all you end up doing. That if you really want a diverse diet and a lot of different kinds of plants, you got to drive to different locations to find these plants. It's not all in your local neighborhood.
Yeah.
And so, my goal is not to live off of wild foods. My goal is to get people back to, if they want, the ability to be able to do what our ancestors did in a way that adds to their everyday life. So I supplement my diet all the time with wild foods. So I've got wild foods. I promote them around my own yard so I can gather them easily. And when I do research, I'm gathering a lot of particular plants to do the research, but I'm also eating them while I'm doing the research.
Mm.
But I'm not trying to live off of wild foods. I supplement my diet with wild foods. And that's what I actually, in my volume 1 of my book series, that's what I promote, is the idea that once you know enough wild foods, then you go after wild fast food. You know, what's convenient? What can I grab that isn't going to take me a lot of time because everybody's busy today? You know, who has time to do anything? So, you know, if you can find a food, grab it, you know, throw it in with your salad, and it's easy, you're going to do it. If you're going to have to process acorns every day and you've got a life, you're not going to do it. So, you know, wild fast food is the focus. How can you do it quickly, easily? And that's why I don't know if it was clear from my book, but I'm covering universal plants. Those plants are found throughout Europe. They're found throughout North America. They're found in Australia. I mean, they're found all over the globe, most of them. And that's because, you know, I want people to find these foods. And they're what I call plants native to humans. They follow us around everywhere. We disturb the soil, they grow. And so they're easy. They're right around us. You can grab them and you can add them to your diet. And so it's sort of an easy supplementing your diet with wild foods.
I mean, I know you're keen to emphasize that your personal practice isn't something of 100% living off wild foods. It's great that you're wanting to represent that accurately. But I would still say that your education is coming out of your personal practice. And I think that's what's so important about it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you do a lot of research, really test these things, you know, you figure out what's been clearly edible from the literature, and then you do experiments and you try every single way to work with them, and you're creative about it, then it becomes easier to use them in your everyday life. Yeah, which I do. But I still go to the supermarket, I get normal foods, you know, I'm a normal human being. And most people are. And that's the thing, is that if I've got a student who's really interested in doing this, they really want to do wild foods, I recommend they do the same thing, because they got a job, they got a life, they want to go out and dance or, you know, go to dinner or whatever, but they want to supplement their diet with wild foods. That's what I train them to do. So it's convenient.
I'm really interested, though, in seeing the possible kind of link between the very kind of practical and realistic approach you're taking, which is basically saying we've got to start from where we are with busy lives, that we're probably going out there on our own with a basket or whatever to gather a few bits to take back to our own personal kitchen.
Yeah.
But that you're contrasting with where we came from, which is where as a collective we would be working very intensively together in order to feed the whole tribe and so on.
Sure.
I wonder where the two eventually could begin to meet in the middle, because what I'm fascinated by, having done wild food walks and foraging education for quite some time now, I'm beginning to wonder whether finding a way to do that kind of education in a particular place with the same people more intensively. So I'm thinking of starting something up in the village where I am, where the same people year after year after year come together and we actually start doing it together. And then we start seeing that it's actually doing other stuff. It isn't just affecting our diet. It's actually affecting the community cohesion. It's affecting the relationship of the people in that place to the land. But all of this research is, as you're alluding to here, where we're rediscovering what to do with the plants. Plus, you know, no doubt you and I both, a certain amount of what we understand about the plants is coming from the ethnobotanical literature or direct contact with indigenous cultures that have never lost their practices. You know, but I've forgotten what I was going to say now.
Well, it sounds like you're working up to this thing about developing community around wild food, and that would sort of be nice. I have hesitated to do that, and the reason that I've hesitated to do that is, number one, I've got a million things I'm working on, and it's hard to develop a community where you're that invested. But the other thing is that I've found in the past, whenever I've gotten groups together, that I end up being the constant teacher. Like I'm constantly teaching people about everything. And so then the dynamics is not of equals.
Yeah.
It's more like, well, here's the guy who knows. So we're all going to come to you and we're going to treat you differently because you're the guy who knows. And we're going to keep learning off you and stuff like that. Well, this is my full-time job. This is all I do. I don't have a part-time something else. I don't have a full-time something else. I'm strictly a researcher, educator. And so there's only so much time in life. And this is how I make my living, is by educating. And so the other problem with doing that, building a community around this, where I would end up doing the teaching, I'd end up doing it for free because it's my community. And so I'd be giving away all my knowledge and not getting anything back for it. And then I'd have to get a job because I'm not making any money.
That's tricky.
Yeah. So in order to really do this full time, it's got to be a commodity that's valued and that I get some reimbursement for. And it would be a terrible community if they were paying me to be a community member. It just would be absurd. So you see the conundrum there.
Yeah, no, I do. But at the same time, I've got to go round to my local doctor's surgery when I get off this Skype conversation, because I got something stuck in my foot that I need to get out. Now, that guy is being paid to be a medical practitioner in this community. So that's what I'm working on. I'm looking at how could we get funding sources that pay me to be that guy that's available to everybody. So yeah, that's the way we're going at it, John. Yeah, not to I can totally see what you're saying. Nobody that's a plumber is going to just say, "Hey guys, I'll fix your pipes."
Right. Well, I mean, there's barter communities.
Yeah.
But those are small. If the whole society was a barter community, that would be a different story.
Yeah.
But if you're trying to create a small little community with members who come in and out, and some people are flaky and some people are devoted and some people just want to, leech off of everybody else, it's very, very hard to get something that really works beautifully. I don't know if you have co-housing communities in your neck of the world, but
like housing, there's housing co-ops. There's not one particularly near to where I am.
So basically, where you've got several houses and they're all connected, and usually they have a little community center, and so people get into this system, and those rarely work out because people all have different ideas about what they want to do, and the problem is we're an enlightened society, which is great, but it brings in the problem of, well, now we've got all these options. Now we've got all these choices. Back in the early cultures, those cultures were very, very tight. They had mores and they did certain things, and everybody was expected to do their certain role. And so there were a lot of forces that were keeping those communities together. In today's society, there are no forces keeping communities together. They can run off and do whatever they want. Whereas, free will, we've got mobility, we can decide, well, I don't like this group and I'm moving or whatever. In the old tribes, you were in the tribe.
Yeah.
So it's different.
I do wonder whether the old cultures don't point the way back in, though. I mean, when you look at, I guess for me, I keep coming back to this word satisfaction, John. So much of what modern life offers in terms of, the choices and the freedoms and so on, in the end, it doesn't actually lead to people feeling grounded and satisfied. And I think more and more people are asking the question, well, what would, though? And I don't think we're far off a situation in which people would be prepared to make the kind of commitments which wouldn't have been possible 10, 15, 20 years ago. That people are realizing, okay, it's real food that comes from the land that makes my body feel satisfied when I eat. And it's real relationships which involve, long-standing commitment, ongoing commitment, that are not just fly by night. If it doesn't go my own way, I'm leaving, or if there's a bit of conflict, I'm leaving. The people from the outset would start buying into a situation and say, okay, the good stuff is only going to come when we work this and work this and work this and work this. So in other words, I would say that's crucial thing there is that there's a thing called wisdom moving back into the center of things. Whereas this quick fix, I'll get what I want, I'll do what I like, da 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 da. Which, you know, like in the 60s, the hippie thing was, there was a lot of that. You know, I'm going to do it because I feel like it, because it's real to me, and all this kind of thing. But at the same time, people were hanging around with, they were flirting with philosophies that had profound depth and wisdom in them. Mm-hmm. I think just that they just took the kind of pick and mix values out of it, without seeing that but now I think we're coming around to the thing of saying, you know, wisdom involves, you know, it's blood and guts. It means we have to really give ourselves, and we have to take our time to before we get something out of this. We can't just expect to understand wild foods just because we read a book or we went on one of John's courses. I don't know. I'm very hopeful that there's so many things that it's there's a, I'm not going to quite quote it entirely, but there's a line from a punk rock band called The Clash. They said, you know, if you have sex with a nun, you might later join the church.
Okay.
Do you know what I mean? I think we've been flirting with things which are the output of real wisdom traditions for so long. I think sooner or later we're going to accidentally get wise. But that's my long-winded way of saying I think that we're in a time when we might actually succeed in growing community around this stuff.
Well, you know when that'll happen, and that's when we're in the Star Trek economy.
Okay.
You know, in Star Trek, because of robotization and computers and you know, dematerializers and materializers, there was no need. No one had to worry about any needs, food, clothing, shelter, all taken care of, and you didn't have, and there was no monetary system. So people just did what brought them fulfillment. That was the whole idea. You had no longer had the burden of money. And so when that happens, two things will be true. One is we won't worry about money anymore, and people can develop these communities and just do things that are fulfilling, like wild foods and getting back to nature and living off the land more and things like that. But the other thing that'll be true is that almost every bit of land by that time the population will have covered, and we won't have any habitat left. There'll be very little habitat. I mean, it's already happening now. Habitat loss is amazingly rapid. And so we're losing it. Look at what's happening in the Amazon right now. They're trying to cultivate the whole Amazon. The new leader there is like he's letting the place burn. Because he wants farms out there. Well, you know, all those indigenous cultures who are living off the land, they're losing their habitat. Here in Portland, Oregon, where I live, this is a very popular place to live. You know, a lot of the open fields where I used to forage are now houses. You know, so that's an issue. It's not just that, you know, people can want to do something like this. You also have to have access, and you also have to have enough land. I mean, it's easier in rural communities. If you're living in a rural community where there's lots and lots of land and not so many buildings, then there's a lot more access to wild foods. I have plenty of access to wild foods in the city because people plant, you know, beech trees and walnut trees and things in the neighborhoods, and you can gather those too. You can forage for those, neighborhood foraging. But the actual real land that's available is being shrunk every day. And, you know, how many billions are on the earth now, and how many billions more are we predicting in no time flat? You know, so these are things that concern me, which would make something like that a little bit more difficult. Not impossible, but difficult.
I agree with you. But there's another thing that's sort of swallowing the land up, though. You know, on the one hand, we've got buildings, as you say, that mean there's wild food, but industrial agriculture says there's no wild food too, because they spray every inch of it. Now, I think that is not going to carry on indefinitely.
Personally, I think we're going to be going more to most farms are going to turn to hydroponics and things like that because, you know, climate change, erratic weather, droughts, things like that are going to make having a regular farm almost impossible. And so I think almost all of future farming is going to be hydroponics and doing stuff in greenhouses and stuff.
Well, I'm quite hopeful that the agroforestry thing that's gaining traction at the moment is also going to have a big part to play, and that will mean that it's not just the cultivated plants on those areas of land. The hope that I have is that basically the wild food thing will become mainstream because the economic arguments, the ecological arguments, the social arguments, all of the arguments will come together to say, well, actually, if we were just considering one of those things, it would still make sense, that when the land is yielding up plants for which there have been no added inputs, they're just like a byproduct of the fact that we're cultivating this other plant. Well, that's makes sense. Okay. And then when we consider the thing that in the previous scenario, we were spending money on toxic chemicals in order to get rid of that thing, we suddenly realize the thing we're trying to get rid of is an asset. Okay. So now we've got two reasons just in terms of that piece of soil and that land. But then we start looking at the thing which you make such a powerful case for in your work of the superior nutrition of the plants. Now we've got another reason. We'll keep them because actually, in many cases, they're more nutritious than the thing we're trying to grow. And then we look at the social cohesion that can come when people can come in there and gather and prepare foods. We look at the evidence for the mental health benefits of people spending time in green spaces. And then we go to another level and say, okay, well, actually, when people are getting wild foods from their locality, they have a sense of actual they're like bonded to that place. So there's this sense of actually, I'm part of this, and that makes me feel whole. That makes me feel good. Oh, and all of a sudden, that makes me fight to protect it. So this all of these different things working together. I'm really hoping that we will be actually able to make these cases, the case for this, not just to sort of the kind of maverick sector of the population that comes on your courses and mine, John, but it will be making these cases to local councils and healthcare professionals and governments and the World Health Organization. I mean, I don't know, perhaps I'm just too much of an enthusiast, but I'm aiming high with this, John. I think we have to make the case globally that actually we made a mistake when we went so hard into this agriculture thing, and that globally we could actually make it a mainstay of human culture again, that we nourish ourselves from the wild and all of the attendant benefits that I've just described there. I mean, perhaps I'm aiming too high, but
aim as high as you want. Yeah, I guess I'm a very, very practical guy.
Yeah.
And to me, the future of wild foods is edible weeds. And the reason for that is, or again, plants native to humans. I prefer that because I don't like the term weeds, but because there's nothing unsustainable about edible weeds. I mean, they're everywhere. You can gather them to your heart's content. You're not threatening any populations. But again, because society is growing and we're losing land, there's fewer and fewer places left that are native habitats. And if on a massive scale, people went into these areas and were harvesting all the wild foods from these natural areas, that's not sustainable. It's just not going to, I mean, we're talking about billions and billions more people in the next 10 years. So, to me, it's plants native to humans. Those are the ones that we should be going for. Those are the ones that fit better into that scenario of doing it on a regular basis and being more both sustainable and an everyday activity.
Well, I know what you're saying with that, but let me give a couple of examples of habitats and go at it the other way and say, well, here's these habitats. What would happen if we rather than saying, okay, let's focus on the plants natives to humans and leave these alone because it might be over harvested and too much pressure on the habitat. Okay. So we've got salt marsh in England, in the UK, and we've got the lower shore where all the seaweeds are.
Yeah.
In around the British coastline, there's more biomass in terms of seaweed than there is in all of our woodland, and we've still got a fair bit of woodlands. It's nothing to what it used to be 10,000 years ago, but we've still got a fair bit. My concern is we're not eating it, because that seaweed is produced every year and then it gets smashed off, and we have local councils clearing it off the beach so that it doesn't stink and put off the tourists and so on. I would like to see a situation where we're eating a very significant percentage of that biomass. What's going to happen with that situation is that same biomass is going to be not required from an industrial agricultural system. So we'll have gained whatever land we needed in order to produce that many tons of protein and vitamins. Now, if we reach that point where that becomes an integral part of our national diet, everybody's used to eating that much seaweed now, and we expect to have it. That's going to, again, give a reason why we're going to protect those seaweed habitats. Mm-hmm. Maybe we're going to be able to work on edging our way towards something that's sort of half cultivation, half wild, that we somehow extend the habitat by semi-artificial means. Well, of course, by doing that, we'll be extending the habitat of whatever lives with the seaweed.
Yeah.
Okay. So moving on to the salt marsh example, what we have in the UK, especially on the East Coast, where I grew up on the East Coast of England, where there's a lot of salt marsh. But in the past, a great deal of that salt marsh was drained, and they put up sea walls and ran dikes through to turn that into mainly to grazing land, but sometimes it was turned into cultivated land. But now we have a situation where the coastal erosion costs a great deal of money to stop by building artificial sea defences. And the Environment Agency, who's the government body responsible for that here, are beginning to say, I think we're going to let some of this just go back to the sea. When they say back to the sea, they mean back to the salt marsh.
Right.
Now, my point would be, if we saw the economic and the health benefits value of all of those wild edible plants there, that would be a much easier decision to make, because in the past, a few people might have got them, but somebody made a decision at some point, we'll make more money if we drain that and put sheep on it. But like, if we're now letting that go back to the sea, and we're at least when it's high tide, and we're able to forage all of those plants, again, that's a very, very substantial amount of food could come off there. So I guess I'm trying to think about it that way. What if? Yeah.
That's a good example, but it's a very specific one. I think seaweeds have so much potential for a variety of things, including certain seaweeds. If you feed them to cattle, they produce less methane. Yeah. So if we could, ramp up that, but again, that's industry harvesting the huge quantities of that and then giving it to, cattle ranchers. But I also see seaweeds as one of the potential, not cures, but mediation of climate change.
Absolutely.
Because but this is on a massive industrial scale I'm talking about, not just wild foods. But I'm saying, these guys absorb so much carbon dioxide, and we've got the whole ocean to deal with. If we can start all sorts of trellises and things like that, where we're actually producing seaweed just to capture CO2, not even eating it. I mean, we could do ones that are edible too, and bring that into the population. You can only eat so many seaweeds though, because they're too high in minerals, and you'd get digestive problems if you eat too much seaweed. But try and get it more into everybody's diet. But massively grown could help with climate change. We've got the Amazon forest going up in flames now. Maybe that could be our next Amazon, where it's taking a lot of the CO2 and creating more oxygen stuff. So seaweeds have huge potential. Foraging, if you're going to forage seaweeds, that means you have to have a boat, or you're going out at low tides, and you're going in certain areas that where it grows. So those are all activities that take time for people. And for people like me, I'm happy to do it. But I find that most of the times that I go now, because I've got so much in my refrigerator and my freezer, and I've got so much dried, every time I teach a class, I have another opportunity to harvest. And so I've got plenty. But, people actually have to be able to go out and do that. And again, how can they do that sustainably? So even though there may be an unlimited supply of seaweeds, on the way to walking out there at low tide, how many people can the habitat, the tide pools, how much foot traffic can they survive and still support all the other life that's out there? Because that, to me, that one of the biggest problems with our tide pools here in Oregon is that most people don't know how to walk on them. And they're killing all these species because there's no education about, how do you move around within nature so that you're not killing everything on the way to the food that you're trying to get. So, and the same thing in the woods, when you're dealing with a forest, if you're on trail, you only have access to so many wild foods. As soon as you grow off trail, you're compacting the duff and making that habitat more conducive to weeds than you are to the native plants. The more compressed that soil gets from walking around on, the less conducive it is for native plants. And so, again, the more people that do it, that's sort of where I'm at. When I teach my classes in certain forests here, and I go down the same exact trail every year. So I've taught thousands of students along the same trail. Those plants are still there. Why are they still there? Because I'm also teaching about sustainability and, saying spread out, go to different locations, try not to, concentrate in one location. And so all the plants that I started with 25 years ago are still in those same woods and still along the trail. Yeah, it's a complicated thing. I have friends that think that humans are the scourge of the earth. Like we're destroying the planet. And, the more we're out there, the more we're making things bad. So to me, yeah, sustainability is a huge thing. Knowing how to be in nature. So all of that education has to be part of learning about wild foods. Not just the plants, but where are you? What are you doing to the habitat that you're in? If you're harvesting nettles all the time in one patch and you compact that soil, you're going to destroy the nettles. So, it's not just the foods, it's how you, move yourself around in nature.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything you're saying there just is like an add-on to your original statement there, John, about your role being one of like a tribal elder, because obviously we need that. And again, it comes back to wisdom. It isn't just like a couple of isolated facts, which are enough to give somebody the equipment to go out there and do some harm.
Right.
So we don't need isolated facts. We need a cohesive, system of practical knowledge, which has been built up by people that have worked in and with these ecological contexts over a long period of time and found out what the pitfalls are. One thing I would say, though, is that when even a small amount of work is done in this area, i.e. a person learns a few plants and gets out there and starts picking, they're already in a far better situation than they are with anything that they purchase. And what I mean by that is that they're going back to a place over year after year, once they've made that connection with plants that are growing in a particular place. So they will see before their very eyes the damage that they've done if they are doing something in an unsustainable way. And I think that's a really important point, because, when you buy something, you're completely cut off unless somebody's going to feed it back to you and tell you about the Amazon rainforest where the soil was grown to feed the cow that you think is an organic grass-fed cow, but it's actually been eating feed in the winter that came from some, unless somebody does work to give you that feedback, you don't see it. And the other thing I would say is that in the context of any local situation, especially where we start to get this community element in, I feel that we're moving back to a time when those kind of mores that you were talking about are going to develop. That we see in our village, we have a really quite clear idea about what we do with this particular harvest, because we've noticed in the past that when we did this, this happened.
Right.
We had to get together and talk about it. Say, we've got a problem here. How are we going to make sure this doesn't happen? Or on the positive side, somebody's tinkered around and like we do with one of the allium species called crow garlic here. We harvest the bulbils, which is one of the reproductive parts.
Yeah.
But we'll take 3 and scatter 2.
Yeah.
So we'll break them up and throw them around. And I'm sure that we're enhancing the population with that. And we've done the same with wild cabbage seed. So on the other hand, we have these mores to do with how to enhance the population. And then thirdly, just to look at the same thing in a slightly different way, what we're looking at, if people start doing stuff collectively in a given area or individually, but they realize that they're accountable to each other. I can't trash the wild blackberry population because it's going to annoy you. You'll say, where's the blackberries, Miles? And so on. But we are then back to a situation of managing common resources. And I think that's tremendous. But it does mean, again, it has to have that social element that we sit down and thrash it out. And you could be really pissed off at me because I've done it this way and you think it should be done that way. But in this collective context, we thrash it out. And eventually we say, no, okay, John's right and Miles is right. It's a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And then we start having this culture around the common practice of how to work with these things. So, I think we've got all these things ahead of us. Obviously, climate change is right in the slap bang in the middle of this. But for me, I feel that climate change is whilst it's a terrible catastrophe that's unfolding before us, it is also something that is forcing practical areas of innovation, which simply wouldn't have happened otherwise. Like what you're saying about the seaweed, I think that's just amazing. But I would want to push that human dietary factor in the seaweed possibility that you just aired there, because we've certainly got a long way to go before the whole global population has reached that threshold that you mentioned there of eating enough seaweed but not too much. So I think we could find homes for that. But the other thing is, I'm finding what you've said so stimulating. I've kind of got a lot to say in response to it. So forest, John, in the UK, we've got areas of highlands in Scotland, which are actually the scars of deforestation in the past. Humans went up, cleared the forests, and it's all gone to very acidic soil now, and it's covered in heather, and it's beautiful, but it's not doing anything that's feeding into, it's not producing any resources for food or anything else. We reforest that, all of a sudden, we've got a vast area that's got mushrooms on it. So all of a sudden, so this is the kind of thing that is also possible to recreate habitats which are very productive for wild foods.
Oh yeah, and then we've got people, mostly permaculture people, who are working on food forests here. Where they're taking vacant land and they're creating, a place where it does nothing but produce food.
Yeah.
So that's sort of similar idea to that. So, seaweeds are great. Again, even if we don't eat them, they're great for mitigating the climate issue. But, integrating them in the diet, that's a whole nother story. And we've done it, around here. We've got a lot of Asian restaurants and they do sushi and all that kind of stuff. So you have seaweeds in that. When I teach my seaweed classes, I call them sea vegetables. I have my students test them all fresh and recommend don't even dry them, unless you're going to store them for a while. But I say just throw them in a salad, throw them in a sandwich, throw them in your spaghetti, just chop them up and mix them with stuff and just eat it that way. You don't need a recipe, just throw them in everything. And so, to get rid of that intimidation factor, oh, there's seaweeds, what do I do with them? And I need a recipe and I got to do something, and it's people just end up not doing anything. But again, you don't want to overdo it. If you're eating way too much seaweed, then you're going to start having digestive problems. It's just too much mineral for you to manage. And so you need a diverse diet that includes seaweed. But you don't just eat gobs and gobs and gobs of seaweed.
So, John, it would be fun to hear kind of some of your story as to how you ended up doing what you do.
Well, when I was growing up, I was always interested in outdoor skills. So, my motto was sort of like Native Americans. As a kid, I was always in the woods, rubbing two sticks together to create fire, never succeeded. Making shelters, making bows and arrows, doing all those kinds of things that Stone Age people would do, because it brought me closer to nature. And it wasn't until I got into late high school and early college that I started realizing that almost everything that Native peoples did was oriented around food. What was the bow and arrow for? Gather food. What were the baskets for? Gather food. It's like almost everything that they had, except for ceremonial things, art, everything was oriented around food. And so that's when I started focusing on that. And I'm not a hunter, but I do love the idea, always did love the idea of foraging. Now, I said earlier that, to me, my bottom line is I'm an educator. I'm like sort of like a born educator. That's part of my being, my essence. And so I was starting to take education classes after a short stint in pre-med, and realized that I could, as long as I was teaching, I would be happy. And wild foods was so exciting to me that I thought, why don't I teach that? Which means I also got to learn it. Which, now here I am with all this bad literature and bad sources of information, struggling for years and years and years. And so, but still, persistent about it, even though the first time I tried dandelions, I didn't know what I was doing and I hated them. That didn't stop me.
Could you say a bit more about the bad literature and the bad information? Because I think it's good for people to understand that background.
Well, okay, so, when I got started, there were almost no books on wild foods. It was all survival literature. Right. And survival literature is really bad on wild foods. They don't know anything, and they give you bad advice. And, they got somebody in a survival situation, and what, you're leeching acorns in a survival situation? You got the enemy chasing you in the woods and you're going to leech acorns? It's total ignorance about what's possible. And some of the information was just dead wrong. A lot of it was just dead wrong. But there were a couple of old books on survival, or on wild foods specifically. I remember Bradford Anger had some books. Alan Hall had a wild food field guide. I don't know how you guys were in Britain, but here there was very little, and it was before Yule Gibbons wrote his books. And so, basically, even those early books were very, very simplistic, and they were like catalogs. They just had one picture and a page with very brief information, and not enough to really be practical, not enough to identify the plant, not enough to be sure about what to eat on it, and not enough information to know how to prepare it properly. And then when I teach my students, I teach them about the definition of wild foods is a plant that has one or more parts that can be used if gathered at the appropriate stage of growth and properly prepared. Those are three key bits of information that those books just didn't fulfill. That information wasn't there. And I tell my students now, if you don't know each of those things about a particular plant, you don't know enough to even try it. What part on that plant? If you're eating a plant that has poisonous stems and edible berries, or poisonous leaves and edible berries, and you just decide, well, if it's an edible plant, I can just make tea out of the leaves. No. You've got to know enough about those plants in order to use the whole thing. So, so in any event, it was just, school of hard knocks for a long time, muddling through, trying different things. I got every wild food book and survival manual I could find in those days, and just used them like an encyclopedia. I would just look up every plant, a single plant in every one of those, and see whatever they said, and then I would experiment with the plant. And then when I was a sophomore in college, I decided to take a vagabonding trip through Europe. Back in the days when you could still hitchhike everywhere. I don't know, now you probably can't. Like here, nobody hitchhikes anymore.
I think you'd be waiting a longer time than you used to.
Yeah, so in any event, I vagabonded around, England, France, Italy, Greece, and while I was there, one of my goals was to learn about wild foods. And so as a hitchhiker, people were very friendly. They'd pick you up, and then, they'd go, well, where are you going? And I'd say, where are you going? And so then I would just ride with them into their small village somewhere in the middle of nowhere. And then we'd have, by that time, have made friends, because, Americans in those days were not the ugly Americans they are today. People actually wanted to be with Americans. And so they would invite me over for dinner, then they'd invite me to stay over. And so, I'd be there almost every third trip in a car. Somebody would have me over for dinner and overnight. And while I was with them, particularly in France, they'd have these 7-course meals. It was a normal day, and I'm like eating 7 courses of dinner. And so I'd ask the food preparer, do you eat any wild foods? And, we're talking 1975 here. In those days, they always said yes. And I'd say, well, can you show me tomorrow what you gather and eat from here? And so they would show me all the plants that they gathered, how to identify them, what parts that they ate on them. The next person that I got picked up by and you did the same thing with, I'd ask them, and they'd show me. And by the end of the trip, I was getting all my vegetables from wild foods. And so, but I was still, getting baguettes and sausages, and, I was a big milk drinker, which everybody thought I was a baby because no one drinks milk in Europe, me. But in any event, by the time I got back, I was in graduate school at the time, right after that, and the dean of the Department of Parks and Recreation said, you should teach a class on wild foods. And I said, I don't know anything. And he goes, I know about your trip. And he goes, you know more than anybody else in this university. And he goes, that makes you an expert. And so he goes, I want you to teach, start preparing. And I spent a couple of years doing real concentrated work with the idea now that I was going to teach other people about this. And so getting into the ethnographic literature and the scientific literature, and learning about setting up classes and doing tests and all that kind of stuff. And so for, I think, 5 or 6 years, I was teaching at the university level. And I was still in I was working on my master's program in the beginning, and then my PhD after that. But yeah, I was teaching classes as a student there. And I had, 70 people per class, and I had, lectures and lab where we would go out and identify all the plants and stuff like that. And as soon as I finished my PhD, and the reason I got the PhD in nutrition was to advance the field of wild foods. People make up stuff all the time in the wild food literature about nutrition. So, I wanted to sort of legitimize that part of the field. And so then when I finished my PhD, I said, hey, I'm free, I'm not married, I can go move anywhere I want, and I can just start a career doing nothing but this. So I moved to Portland, Oregon.
Was there some really important things that influenced that decision to move to Portland, Oregon, with regard to
adventure, mountains, snow-capped mountains within an hour's drive of all the big cities. The ocean was within an hour's drive of all the big cities. The Columbia River Gorge. I mean, this place is just amazing. And so, I had several places. I was thinking San Francisco, Seattle, Portland, but Portland just had everything, and it wasn't too big. Seattle and San Francisco were just overrun with humans, and this place was still growing. I mean, we're getting there now, but it had just the right size, because I needed enough people to supply a population of students to make my classes viable. Too small of a community and you don't have enough students. So, so I chose to move here, felt at home right away. And within, I think, 3 years of moving here, I did wild foods part-time while I had other jobs. I think about 3 years after moving here, I was doing wild foods full-time. So that's all I do, research and education. I'm not a nonprofit, so I don't have grants or anything like that. You have to be a nonprofit in order to get grants. And so...
Is there a reason you haven't gone down that route, the nonprofit thing?
No, because I wanted to own it. You know, when you become a nonprofit, your business or educational institution becomes a public institution, and then there's a board of directors, and then you lose control. And so the only way that I could keep doing exactly what I want to do is to make it a business and an educational business, which is really hard to do. It's, you know, I'm not a wealthy man by any means. I was thinking of self-publishing the book series that I have in mind, and then I was teaching at a outdoor skills event, which I do on occasion. This fellow comes up to me and he says, you should write a book. You seem to know more than anybody else on this. And I said, yeah, I think I am. I want to self-publish at some point. He goes, why do you want to self-publish? I said, because no one will let me do what I want to do. You know, like most of the publishers want that formula where you're just doing a catalog kind of a book. And he goes, I'll let you do whatever you want. Well, this guy didn't look very, you know, he looked pretty disheveled, and I, you know, thought he's working out of his garage, and I thought, well, I could do just as good as that. And he kept calling me every year for about 3 or 4 years, and finally he sent me a catalog, which was about that thick, of all the books that his company publishes. And I thought, well, this guy knows what he's doing. And since he would let me do whatever I wanted, that's, you know, why the first book looks like it does, because that was the design that I wanted. That was the approach that I wanted. I wanted to spend lots of time on each plant, do a chapter per plant, lots of photographs, clear descriptions of everything, close-ups of edibles at their prime, all that kind of stuff. And so right now I'm working on volumes 2 and 3 of the book series, but yeah, it's the way I wanted it to be.
And I feel like probably you along with Samuel Thayer have probably set the benchmark for how to write books about wild plants for the future.
Yeah, we've got a different style. He, I think, is writing more for the advanced forager, like somebody who already knows stuff. And I'm working from the standpoint of, you could be a beginner or an advanced forager. I'm writing this book so that you know everything from A to Z.
Yeah.
You know, that's my approach. I know there's going to be advanced people, but everybody who's been an advanced forager who's bought the book has liked it anyway. So it's not, you know, like they're missing out. And I do have features in there that nobody else has, like the nutrition charts and stuff. That's
exactly.
You're not going to find that anywhere else. So, yeah, so we do have a different approach in that regard. But he's great. I mean, he's a fantastic educator and forager.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you both do is to go into a great deal of depth on not so many species. So you're doing it to get the beginner to get off to a good start and have that confidence, because you break it down from the basic identification, and I think you spend a lot more time on the identification, whereas Samuel's going really in depth in the overall experience of that plant and everything you can do to process it, things like that. But I guess my book is different in that I tried to get as close to covering all of the different plants in the British Isles, and I think a friend of mine, Robin Harford, has since then generated a list which is roughly twice as many plants as in my book, which were going to be really thorough. But I was trying to be as thorough as I could without giving a sketchy approach, and I have to say I was influenced by what you and Samuel were saying, in that I didn't write about any plant that I hadn't actually encountered and eaten, all except one. I ended up with a plant called mountain sorrel in my book, which to this day I still have not found. I worked really hard to find it. I put the feelers out for lots of people to try and send me some that had it near them. But I thought, well, it's okay because mountain sorrel is, in culinary terms, so close to the other ones that it wasn't a crime. But I after reading your stuff, I just thought I'm simply not going to write about anything unless I've actually eaten it. And I did my best to get it, to cook with it, and also to get chefs to experiment with it, so I could get the take on it from chefs.
But your primary business is supplying restaurants, is it not? Or do I understand that correctly?
It has been up to now, but I'm now. I mean, it's quite a nice way to say this. It's just in conversation with you, but at the moment I'm kind of edging away from the focus on that, because what I feel we've done is we have accomplished something, and not just us, but like we've been part of a process whereby the chefing world has become aware of all of these many plants and seaweeds and so on, up to the point where they can see the fact that you can eat them, and there's a certain amount of work being done on how to use them. So that's kind of job done in a way, me and all the other people that have been doing that kind of work. But where my kind of interest lies, and I guess my motivation lies now, is to try and work on taking that a bit deeper, like what is this plant in relation to its ecology? What is eating this plant in relation to the global food system, or to human health in terms of nutrition and things like that, or in terms of our relationship to our ancestors, where we used to be, with a much more synergistic relationship to the planet. I do generally that the chefs are not particularly interested in continuing with us on that journey. They basically are happy to have the supply of the plant and don't want to take it any deeper, which I have to say, I think it is something that will probably change. I imagine that in a few years' time, everyone's going to be engaging with these issues, and restaurants will see the opportunity that they have, which I think they're missing at the moment, which is to take the dining experience to a whole other level of depth by communicating to their guests, and by making their business model something that is far more about sustainability, which at the moment people think that in terms of waste management and so on. But I think if a restaurant saw that its potential role was to dramatically alter the relationship that the people that eat there have, totally, human health, their body, the landscape, reverence for traditional cultures in order to bring those old ways back, all of those kind of deep things. But I think the restaurants, at the moment, they've got, okay, well, we've got enough to work on. You've given us challenging ingredients, and we're trying to get them into the thing. So, I find it just I don't get the engagement from those guys that I am getting from people who are starting from the interest in nutrition. They're starting from the interest with having a relationship to the land or being more sustainable. So the long, tall and short of it is I'm moving now more into education and specifically into trying to do things which are about community development or bringing healing to people. With in initial discussions with some people around bringing wild food experiences to people suffering from mental health difficulties, who are homeless, and kids and things like that. So yeah, that's more where I'm going. And we've set up a community interest company called the World Wild Community Interest Company, and that's the objective of that basically is to see all the benefits that come when people connect with land through gathering and eating wild plants. But I mean, it's just great to talk to you, John, and be aware of what's going on in other parts of the world to achieve this same objective, basically. I mean, I think the fact that we can talk to each other on Skype, and you gave the example of the Asian restaurants opening the door to the use of seaweeds there, and I think that's an example of what we've got. I've got quite a protracted critique of technology if we were to get into it. But I'm also very aware of the benefits of this kind, that people can share knowledge about essentially the same stuff that's being tinkered with in completely different parts of the world, and that together we can really, have a much better experience of eating wild stuff by comparing notes in this way.
Yeah, but what's interesting here is, think of the potential that Mexican restaurants, you don't eat seaweeds in Mexican restaurants. Italian restaurants, you don't eat seaweeds in Italian restaurants, at least not in this country. And so really the only cuisine that you get seaweeds in here are Asian cuisine.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, American cuisine, no seaweeds, no sea vegetables. So the potential is there. The question is, again, acceptance by a general public. That's the other thing. It's sort of like people are habitual. They like what they like. They don't want to try new things. I remember I made this huge, beautiful wild salad for my family for a Thanksgiving dinner. And my mom said, "We're not eating that."
Oh, no.
She goes, "We're not eating that." And I go, "Why are we not eating that?" Because she goes, "It's not a Thanksgiving food." And so, it was sort of like there is an inertia that people have about what they're already doing that makes venturing into this new stuff very difficult. So most of my students are adventurers.
Yeah.
They want to learn new things. They want to try new things. They're open to new things, new flavors, new knowledge, things like that. But a lot of people just don't care. I went on a hike 2 days ago with a whole bunch of social friends. They know what I do for a living. And so I gathered some fairy bell berries, which are perfectly edible. And I took them and we stopped and people were having some wine and, a couple of other snacks. And I go, "Here, I gathered some berries. Who wants to try these?" Out of 12 people, 2 would even try the berries. And they were delicious and they loved them, the people that tried it. But the others were just sort of like, it's not in my domain. It's not what I do. I'm already drinking my wine and, eating my grapes. And why would I want to eat anything I don't know already?
I must admit, I don't encounter that kind of conservatism. I don't know why that is. Perhaps, I don't know what that says about my context, but yeah, that's.
And it could say a lot about that particular group of friends. I don't know, but So if people aren't there specifically for wild foods, because if I'm in classes, people are happy to sample stuff. If I'm teaching students that paid me to take the class, they're going to sample things. But if I just go with a bunch of people that have no connection to wild foods, no necessary interest in it, they're not going to try it. Yeah. So that's just the way things are. Now, if they were served in a restaurant, that's a different story, because there's a sort of a ceremony about going into a restaurant and you're being given this glorious plate that looks great and it's got all this food on it and you don't really care. I mean, people garnish things with flowers they've never seen before. They're happy to eat that because, it's on the plate that the chef gave you. But, in normal everyday life, it's not that. You're not there to eat and be treated by the chef. The chef is doing all the work. The chef is setting everything up for you. The chef is the person you're there for. And so you're more likely to do it.
All right, John, well, it's super cool to have you.
Great talking to you. I'm so happy we have this Skype thing that we can communicate like this rather than emails or even the phone. It's so much nicer this way. Take care.
So thanks for joining us again on this week's World Wild podcast. And just to say, we'd love to hear from you. We're currently looking at building a website for the whole World Wild project, which is going to create a much more sort of appropriate link to the podcast than the current Forager website does, which is kind of linked to our restaurant supply business. But for now, you can certainly email us at hello@forager.org.uk. Which is our main contact email for Forager, and just let us know, where you are in the world and what the podcast means to you, and if you've got any feedback or comments, we'd love to hear that. So do be in touch and let us know what your experience is with this stuff that we're putting out every week. Okay, that's it for this week's World Wild podcast.